this is how the adoption mechanism drives. It's NGU first. The only way it works is if this thing outcompetes every other asset. Otherwise, we're back in 2010 playing around on message boards. No. Now it's like $2 trillion asset, right? So it has to be NGU first. That's where 21 million comes in. And then we get freedom go up. Like, I think a lot of people are black-pilled, right? They're like, okay, fuck, like Marxism, it didn't really work. We couldn't take power from the capitalists. Capitalists are like, man, it's hard to fight the public state, this ever-growing, life-sucking socialist monster. Like, there's a lot of black pilling on both sides, right? So I don't know whether I'm right, but it's great to believe in something that, I don't know, it just fills me with like complete unstoppable optimism about how we can have a better future.
We're back, round two. So we've tried to record this show back in December, had a few technical issues, but it was a really great conversation. So I'm glad we can do it again. So we've got to try and recapture some of the magic. So I think probably the best place to start, Fictitious, you're new to this show. You've not been on before. Do you want to give a bit of a background about who you are and what you do? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me on. It's great to be here and, been following the show for a long time. So I think basically I have a Substack that I've been writing for the past 2 years. The premise behind this is that I think, the decade that we're in, the years that we're in are years of big historical change. A lot is happening very fast, both the speed and the intensity of and the scale of change is much larger than people know of. And so my newsletter is a way of like getting people down to the bare bones of like, it's hard to talk about what's happening and what will happen. Let's first try and understand the basics of like the world that we live in. And I take that from 3 perspectives: one, energy, raw materials, and then, finance, economics, money, or whatever. So I think these 3 are the intersection of, the system we live in. So I try to write explainers about that, try to get people on the same page about like, if we have a shared understanding at least of how things work, which should be based in facts and objective reality, then we can have debates about how we should change the world, what should come after this, etc. I think too many people end up talking past each other because they don't have a shared baseline understanding of the status quo, and that's sort of being my mission to say, okay, we can disagree about how we think the world should change and what it should look like, but the world works in a very specific way, and we should be able to be on the same page about how that works. So that's what I do. I have a Substack that's been going on for a couple of years now, and I try to write pieces from all 3 perspectives, try to dissect global issues and current affairs from either the energy or the raw materials or the finance, econ perspective.
Okay, great. And Alex, the audience obviously knows and loves you, but just in case we do have any new listeners, and also to help kind of lay out the context for this conversation, do you want to just do a brief introduction about who you are and what you do at HRF?
Sure. So I've been working at the Human Rights Foundation since 2007. We help promote civil liberties under authoritarian regimes around the world. I also developed separately an interest in technology and how it can both repress but also liberate people. I come at Bitcoin from a very, I guess, unique perspective, from a humanitarian human rights perspective, not a computer science or Wall Street perspective. So I tend to think of myself in some ways as a progressive person, and Bitcoin's been dominated obviously by a lot of libertarian and even sort of conservative thinking. So I've been interested in dialoguing with and engaging with people who are addressing Bitcoin from an educated, more progressive perspective. And Fictitious is definitely one of those people. I think we agree on quite a bit. We're probably not going to talk too much about that here. But generally speaking, we agree that the world financial system is extremely exploitative, especially towards essentially, what do you want to call them, poorer countries or global majority countries where most of the people and resources are. We very much agree on that. We also agree that Bitcoin is very interesting and that it's, probably a very good savings technology. So he's not like some no-coiner. And he's got a lot of interesting things I agree on in terms of his dynamic perspective on how energy systems work and how labor works and things like that. We have some disagreements about how Bitcoin will be adopted moving forward. and also about, whether it's good or bad that Wall Street and nation states are starting to get into the game here. So I think that's where we should sort of focus is on our disagreements. But it's nice, I think, to have a conversation with someone who has extremely different perspectives than probably 90% of the Bitcoiners you hear on the circuit, right? But hey, he is a Bitcoiner, and in the lowest common denominator sense of the word. I mean, he uses the technology, but he's thought a lot about the technology. He's written some things for Bitcoin Magazine, and it'll be fun to go back and forth a little bit here.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right place to start, because Fictitious, you're going to disagree with Alex a lot today. But so the audience knows you're not just a salty no-coiner, do you want to give a quick introduction on how you see Bitcoin fitting into the world?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I often say that in the real world, like outside Twitter, when I talk about Bitcoin, people call me crazy, you're a Bitcoiner or whatever. In the Bitcoin space, people think I'm a no-coiner, so I oscillate between the two
Right.
spaces. So look, I think as Alex said, I'm pro Bitcoin in two ways, right? One, as an asset, I own Bitcoin. I've been in the space as an investor for 2 or 3 years. That's where I found out about Bitcoin. So I definitely think it's a great asset to own. I have it. I'm long Bitcoin. All of that's good stuff. I also think it has very good use cases. So, over the past 2, 3 years, one of the first ways I got into Bitcoin actually was through the Bitcoin mining. This is at the peak of it uses too much energy. This is a big problem, whatever. So given my electricity background, that's how I actually got more interested in the technology. And I think I wrote a piece, my first piece on Bitcoin was about, dispelling the usual myths about too much energy use, talking about how distributed energy systems can benefit from Bitcoin, the microgrid system. I worked with actually a couple of startups who are trying to do this both in the US and in Africa as well, trying to use Bitcoin mining for micro and mini grids for electricity proliferation. So in all those things, I think it's great. And then over the past year or so, I've thought more about Bitcoin at the super macro reserve asset level, and at that part also, I think it's it has space there. I think it has a use there, it has space there. And then the last thing, which I think Alex obviously works mostly on, is about people who don't have access to financial services, who don't have access to payment systems, etc., especially in global South countries. Or in war-torn areas, obviously Bitcoin is a wonderful piece of technology for them to transfer value, store value, and access a global network. So all of those things I think are very good use cases, very pro-Bitcoin from all those perspectives. I think where I disagree is not with Bitcoin as a technology. It's, I think, how Bitcoiners frame, what you can call the Bitcoin standard. And then increasingly, and sort of more recently, it's increasingly being about who are the champions in the space, right? We've seen so much adoption from, as Alex was saying, from banks, from nation states, from rich people in general. And my big critique of not Bitcoin, but Bitcoiners has been championing some of that form of adoption in those forms of people as figureheads of the movement. I think that for me does a disservice to the promise that the technology posed, even up to a few years ago. So that's where I disagree. But otherwise, I obviously think it would be around for a long time. It has tons of use cases, ever-growing use cases, ever-growing adoption. So this is more about the fight for what Bitcoin should be, rather than, is Bitcoin in and of itself a good thing or not?
And if I may, I just to add to that, I think basically the idea here is what we're debating is we both think Bitcoin is super useful as a tool for different applications, whether it be accessing stranded energy and turning that into something useful, or being a tool for someone who's not connected to the financial system, who's being censored, or who just doesn't have paperwork. And I think we also agree that it's good savings technology in the long term. Where we would disagree here is that I think Fictitious is essentially saying it's going to have that role, but the broader kind of credit and fiat system is essentially going to continue. Whereas I think that we are going to go to a Bitcoin standard. I think that fiat currency will die and be replaced by this new technology. And I think everything we've seen so far is milestones along the way to that transformation. So again, like we have some great things we agree on. I think we disagree on like the big picture, like where are we going, right?
Yeah. I think I will just before you asking this question, Danny, I think I would slightly tweak what Alex was saying. I don't think for me, it's not about whether the fiat system will exist or whatever. For me, it's like, we don't know. And I think the difference between Alex and me is we have a different perspective of causality, basically, about how change happens. For me, we don't know what the monetary system will look like. That's the feature. I think there's, as Alex was saying, we both agree that the system needs to change. And I think as we change the fundamental sort of basis of society, which we think, causes oppression and exploitation, as that changes, there will be a new monetary system. I just don't know what that will be. And I don't think anyone should be saying what that will be. That is, as I keep saying on Twitter a lot, that is an outcome. That's not the import. The monetary system is an outcome of a new socioeconomic paradigm, rather than having the monetary system come first and the socioeconomic paradigm change afterwards. So that's my thing. I don't know what the future will be, and I think that's not for me, it's the wrong question to ask. Basically, that's the difference.
What Bitcoin did is brought to you by our lead sponsor and massive legends, Iron, the largest Nasdaq-listed Bitcoin miner using 100% renewable energy. Iron are not just powering the Bitcoin network, they're also providing cutting-edge computing resources for AI, all backed by renewable energy. We've been working with their founders, Dan and Will, for quite some time now, and have been really impressed with their values, especially their commitment to local communities and sustainable computing power. So whether you're interested in mining Bitcoin or harnessing AI compute, Iron is setting the standard. To find out more, head over to iron.com, which is IREN.com. This episode is brought to you by River. There are many places to buy Bitcoin, but there's no exchange like River. They have innovative products, phone support, and a dedication to security that you just don't get elsewhere. With River, buying Bitcoin is easy. You can set up zero-fee recurring buys to automatically stack sats, and River also lets you earn daily Bitcoin interest on your cash balance that outperforms most high-yield savings accounts. With River, your Bitcoin is stored safely in multi-sig cold storage, plus you have peace of mind knowing they do monthly proof of reserves and hold all client Bitcoin that wasn't withdrawn to self-custody. Open an account for yourself or your business at river.com/WBD, which is RIVER.com/WBD.
Okay, so on your point that you raised about like Bitcoiners cheerleading the state, this is something that I'm quite sympathetic with your opinion on that, Fictitious. So we definitely want to get into that. But I think we should go right back to the start. This debate first arose after Alex put a tweet out, which included an Alan Farrington essay, Wittgenstein's Money. Now, in that essay, Alan lays out basically an argument that the critics of Bitcoin, who may argue that Bitcoin is not really a store of value, a medium of exchange, or a unit of account, are really concentrating on the semantics rather than reality. And in reality, Bitcoin is being adopted as money by people all over the world. Do you think that's a fair summary of that article, Alex?
Yeah, I think it is.
And so in that, you obviously found a few flaws, Fictitious. What are your arguments against that?
I think there were two things. One was more about the content and one was more about the framings. Maybe I'll start with the framing first. I actually think I read the article a couple of times after our previous recording. And my main reflection was, I think a lot of what Bitcoiners do also is what Alan calls like semantics, therefore reality. Because a lot of Bitcoiners will say, oh, it's this like neutral reserve asset. It's an inflation hedge. Those are semantics. Like I've been saying this, sharing evidence about this for a few years. There's no evidence it is an inflation hedge. It is very much, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it just is what it is, right? It's a risk-on asset. It is at best a measure of liquidity of how the market is feeling. It has very strong correlations to the equity market, etc. That's what it is. Just by saying repeatedly that it's an inflation hedge doesn't make it one. Of course, people will say, well, in global south countries with the devaluing currency, with the loose purchasing power, yes. But that's like any global north asset you could buy, the US stocks, and you would be very protected from inflation in Egypt or Nigeria or whatever, right? So that I think is a core thing. I do want to, over this conversation, get more into that because I think that's a fundamental I wouldn't say it's an issue, but it's one of those things where it becomes very hard to actually have a meaningful conversation because most kind of people are talking past each other. They're like, oh no, but it is this, and the other side is like, no, it is not this. And like I said at the start, that's just the wrong conversation to have. It doesn't matter what we think it is. It's more about what role is it playing from a impact, action-oriented perspective. Like, is it a reserve asset thus far? It could be with the Bitcoin reserve or whatever. Is it an inflation hedge? No, skyfire that. So that's one reflection. And then two, I think, Alan, I don't think the explanation of the status quo was correct. I think, it's very much about like, oh, we have this system, this fiat system, credit-based system, debt-based system, whatever, and that system then leads to all these bad things happening, right? Versus for me, it's not that. It's the other way around, right? All these tendencies, these are philosophical, ideological, socioeconomic tendencies for capital accumulation, exploitation of labor, setting up an unfair trade system globally. All those things were the desires people in power had, and then the monetary system was a way to implement those desires or achieve those desires. So I think just from that perspective, like his argument of why Bitcoin is becoming more popular, so it doesn't make sense because it is, again, those same people with the same desires who are also driving Bitcoin adoption. And I don't see this the sort of shift in outcomes or desires for those people, right? It's not like those people have lesser power in today's society. I would say actually they have more power in today's society. It's not like they have changed their desires for capital accumulation or whatever. So I just don't see how replacing fiat with Bitcoin leads to the type of changes that Alan talks about.
Right. So the first one I think is I'll address both points slightly a smaller, and I think we can address it and then move on to the second point, which I think is way more interesting. Look, inflation hedge, I mean, sure, you could say it isn't, or you could say it is. I mean, the fact is, we don't have data from Bitcoin being born into and growing in a world where there's monetary deflation. Like we don't have that data point because we've never seen it. Bitcoin was born into the most inflationary era ever in history, just in terms of just things like base money, amount of credit available, astronomically more so than 40 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. And it's obviously gone from almost zero to $100,000. So, if you're hedging against that, it seems like it's a really smart thing to do. Now, I appreciate that, NVIDIA stock has also done well and a bunch of other things. So I see your point. Our point is that, like, if there were to be this thing that would be like a really good hedge against monetary devaluation, this is what it would look like, and this is what would happen, and this is where it would go, and that's why I think his essay is useful. But anyway, obviously we could, we can disagree on that. It's more of like a perspective issue. The other one is more interesting, actually, is like, so you're kind of like society and politics will drive money. And I think Alan and I are more on like money is going to drive society and politics. Like the technology of money is going to change the world, as opposed to the world's going to change and we're going to settle on this other thing. No. We think Bitcoin is going to change the world because of what it is from a technology perspective. And, what I would say there is that, and we discussed this last time we talked, but basically monetary tech matters. Like it matters that there's money, virtual, digital. We could debate the terms. Gigi prefers digital. He wrote a great essay on this, that it's the only digital money that's not virtual, Bitcoin, because it's tied to the real world and it's scarce and no one can make more of it. But that will have tremendous impact on society and on how people interact with each other if there is a scarce reserve asset as opposed to one that can just be created politically. We, and I just use the royal we for, obviously people like Alan, other Bitcoiners, we think that's going to have a tremendous impact on the world. And, Ethereum wouldn't have the same impact, or euros won't have the same impact. Like this thing's going to actually drive people to change their behavior. It's going to drive states to change their behavior, and it's going to change the whole trade system. So I think that's the interesting part of the conversation, and the way that it folds into, I think the really other important area that we're going to cover is how that plays out. And to me, I'm going to call my thesis the big bad adoption thesis. And I basically, my point is that to all these nefarious actors you point to, which I agree, nation states, big banks, Wall Street, like people are like, to Danny's point, why are you guys getting excited about this? And I think there's a difference between getting excited and just sort of acknowledging that that's the way it's going to go, right? So the big bad adoption thesis is basically like Bitcoin's never gonna succeed if it's like a niche money for cypherpunks on the internet. That would be like PGP, where maybe it's used by a few million people at most. It's really good at what it does, but it never achieves popular mass adoption. And that I think that's just not going to happen with Bitcoin. It's not going to just remain like this dust ball. It's either going to completely become adopted in a really wide scale way, or it's going to burn out and go to zero. And I think if you look at technologies like Signal, they took the promise of what Bitcoin did and they delivered it to the masses, right? Because there are certain trade-offs. And I think you're going to start to see that with Bitcoin. But the thing is, Bitcoin's money for enemies. It's neutral. Everybody will use it. And like any other technology, like email, like any other open source protocol, like email or FTP, everybody can use it and everybody will use it because it's just really useful for something. It's like email. Okay, I don't want to like mail something to somebody. I want to just have it now, right? Like this is not political. This is just like, it's more useful, right? There's no politics to that. It's just like, boom, it's easy. Bitcoin's the same way in many ways. So I think you're going to have people adopt this thing, and some of them are going to hate freedom. Some of them are going to love freedom. It doesn't really matter. So you're going to have people on Wall Street adopt it. You're going to have nation states adopt it. Dictators adopt it. Everybody's going to adopt it. But I guess what Alan is pointing out, what I and others are pointing out, is that that's going to have major impact on the world. In fact, we were dialoguing with Adam Back today, one of the original cypherpunks, and he was saying that Bitcoin's qualities will actually have this massive impact. Its characteristics, its scientific characteristics, will actually change the way governments can operate, change the way wars can be fought, things like that. So I think that's really where we disagree, is like, is Bitcoin an outcome or is it a thing that's going to drive change, right?
Yeah. So I think there are two ways that I would sort of disagree with that. I think the first one is, and this is what the back and forth I've had with Bitcoiners for years now, which is I think there is this conflation of the technological features Bitcoin has with the value proposition that it has. So for example, yes, Bitcoin is an open source network. Anyone can access it. There's a fixed supply, etc., etc. But the jump from those features to those being, value proposition for all use cases, for all contexts, for all societies, that is unclear to me, right? So yes, Bitcoin has features. Yes, adopting them will change behavior in certain ways. No question about that. Is that necessarily a good thing? That depends on the context in which the adoption happens, right? It's not, to me, it's unclear how this argument is made that fixed money supply leads to better, socioeconomic outcomes. That to me is unclear, right? So there's this conflation between features and values. And I think that the value of something, this is, I was making the same point to Adam today on Twitter as well, that value comes from the socioeconomic context. It comes from the socioeconomic paradigm in which something is adopted. I think for the internet, it's the same way. The internet obviously changed everything about how we live in both good ways and bad. But I would find it very hard to say, the internet has somehow led to a decrease in exploitation or oppression or whatever. Yes, obviously it's improved the ways in which people can resist oppression, but it's also increased ways in which people can oppress or exploit or so many other things, right? So for me, technology is an evolution of how things happen, not what is happening, right? The what part is socioeconomic. It's about social drivers. It's about, who owns resources, the power people have, et cetera, et cetera. And then following on from that, I think the second piece is money is a sort of unique concept, even just philosophically, right? It's not exactly comparable to the internet or to email or whatever, because money is this representation of value or of social relations, right? Like money is a representation of trust in society. It's a representation of power in society. Things that, email and internet and, cars, whatever, are not, right? Money as a concept is more similar to like the political system, right? Like the political system that you have, the good ones, the bad ones, but those are, expressions of trust, expressions of power, etc., etc. Money is the same way. And so for me, it's kind of hard to think about someone making the argument that, oh, there's this one political system that is better for all societies across all time. I just don't think that's the case. I think obviously liberals have tried to make that point about democracy for a couple of centuries, but it's actually very hard to define what democracy is, how it works in different contexts, right? Like people in different parts of the world, in different societies have different means of connection. There are geographic differences. There are, ecological differences. Everything just changes the way society is shaped. So for liberals to say, oh, this is one form of democracy, we've perfected it, now you take it, has obviously been a failure, right? And so I think just conceptually, money is the same way. To say that there is this one form of money, Bitcoin or otherwise, right? It's not about Bitcoin. It's just philosophically the point that to say, money has to be XYZ, and that's good for all people, for all times. I find that hard to come to terms with. And I think that is why it goes back to my initial point about it depends on the social relations and the paradigm of that specific society. And in many ways, or in many contexts or many situations, yes, Bitcoin as a medium of exchange would be great. In others, it might be great as a reserve asset. In others, it might be just great as a savings asset. It's just very hard to say, a priori, what that will look like. And so for me, it is more about like, acknowledging the fact that we live in this vast, extremely complex, extremely dynamic world where it's really hard to sort of make these sorts of like descriptive or deterministic predictions. I'm more interested in thinking about like the process that gets us there. And the reason I'm saying this is because that's why I think I'm more critical of the means of adoption than maybe Alex is. Because for me, the process matters a lot. The process does change the end. Whereas for Alex, it might be that, the ends justify the means. And that is obviously perfectly reasonable. It's just a philosophical difference. But that's the philosophical difference I think that we are trying to wrestle between.
Okay, before you jump in there, Alex, I want to go back a little bit. Fictitious, you talk about how a fixed supply of money may not be good in all situations. Can you give an example of when that would not be a good thing?
So I think, let me go back to, I'm trying to answer that first in a more sort of conceptual way, which is to say, what is money, right? It's just abstract concept that people have invented to engage in commerce, right? If I want to buy something from you and you want to buy something from Alex and he wants to buy something from me, money just makes those three transactions easier, right? That's it, right? Money did not exist before humans. It's a human creation. And so for that reason, a fixed money supply, to me, just doesn't even make sense from a possibility perspective. Because if you have a situation where money supply is fixed, that means that there will be some agents in society who have less of it or who don't have access to it in that moment or whatever. That will not stop them from engaging in that transaction. If I'm going to buy something from you and you want to sell that thing to me, but both of us don't have access to money in that moment, we will find another way to do it, right? That's how monetary innovation has always happened. That's how the euro-dollar system got created. No one centrally planned the euro-dollar system, right? It got created in this way where there are people across the Iron Curtain who want to invest in US dollar assets, but outside the US and whatever. So money is very much this not exactly bottom up, but this independent entities doing what's best for them in that moment, right? And so in that way, sure, a fixed money supply could be good, but what is how will people stop different economic agents from who maybe don't have access to that fixed money in that time, or it's very expensive or whatever, coming up with a better or cheaper or just more accessible alternative? That has always happened with money, right? So to have a fixed money supply, you actually need a very authoritarian, bureaucratic system to stop anyone from having innovation, right? That's how, with gold coins or paper money, whatever, that's the thing, right? There's this very bureaucratic, authoritarian system that says you cannot create, the US dollar, or you cannot mint your own gold coin or whatever, right? That is what a fixed money supply is. And it's just never been the case. You can always have fixed money supply as the base asset. I totally agree with that. There have been times that has been the case with, with the gold standard, with the silver standard throughout history, etc. But that was always, to settle transactions across societies in low trust situations, where you don't have repeat transactions. But within society, you have debt-based transactions. If I'm going to transact with you every day and you will transact with Alex every day, there's no need for us to have this fixed money system, right? We will just do what we need to do because we know it will get settled on some ledger, right? And so that's the reason. For me, like I said, I never make claims about a fixed money supply is better or not. Like I said, for a society, it could be. That's for that society's specific context to figure out. I just think, and history tells us this, fixed money supply is impossible to achieve because there will always be people who will innovate their way out of it. And so the question is, how do we stop the proliferation of cheap money going to the wrong people, right? So if money is going to be created, what are the incentives in place to make sure that's being created for productive use, it's not being funneled to people at the top, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where obviously Alex and I totally agree that the current system does do all of those things. Just by fact of paying interest on US treasuries, you are giving a basic income to rich people, right? People who have invested in US treasuries receive trillions of dollars a year for nothing, right? So that, for example, is a very bad form of money creation. So that's, I think, the argument we need to have. What are the guardrails? How do we incentivize the right types of money creation, investment, etc.? Not about there should be a fixed supply and that's it. And then, everything else will just figure itself out.
Yeah. So, no, this is the critical point. It's the fixed supply. What is Bitcoin in the end? It's 21 million. It's the removal of the ability of humans to change the monetary supply. It's fuck you money. It's money that no one else can fuck with. It's your money and no one else can take it. No one else can change it. And that is ultimately what we are saying is good. And I understand if people don't think that's good, that's fine. We're going to have these dialogues. But we're unapologetic about this. This isn't some wishy-washy, oh, well, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. No, we're it's very good. And I think the way that manifests is if we look at it through the lens of something called the hierarchy of money, which is taught by most students around the world who study money and banking, traditionally, it's either at the very top of the hierarchy is something like gold or U.S. treasuries, depending on what era you live in, last couple hundred years, right? Then you would go down to quote unquote money, which might be deposits or time deposits or whatever. Then you would go down further to credit, and then you'd go down further to sketchy derivatives, etc. So essentially you have this risk curve going down of money-like instruments that get sketchier and sketchier and sketchier. And in times of peace and prosperity, people go wild on that risk curve. And in times of scarcity and war, all that stuff gets wiped out and people flock to safety at the top. So this is something that is commonly taught, I think, by both left and right-leaning economists and students, is this hierarchy of money concept. So what we're getting at is the new peak, the new zenith of the hierarchy of money is not going to be government debt or a rock that you dig out of the ground. It's going to be Bitcoin. And Bitcoin cannot be, even in the way gold can be manipulated and sort of pooled and created and it created faster or created slower, or we discover a new deposit, whatever. Bitcoin is just wholly different. It's completely predictable. We know exactly how much is going to enter the system at any one time. We know how much exists now. And that inflexibility at the root, we think is a good thing. Now, I'm not one of these Bitcoiners who thinks there's not going to be debt or credit in the Bitcoin standard. I think that's crazy. There's going to be all kinds of debts and credits. To your point, if two people don't have on-chain Bitcoin in 200 years, they're going to do a monetary transaction. It's just that the money, quote unquote, that they use is going to be less valuable than Bitcoin in terms of it'll be sketchier. It won't have the security of on-chain Bitcoin in the same way that euro dollars, offshore dollars, don't have the same security today as dollars inside the United States that are backed by the Federal Reserve, U.S. Treasury, U.S. law, etc. So you're right that money has always filled the gaps, and I think it will continue to in the future. What we think is just unapologetically better is that the bottom base layer should be something that's neutral and open and the same rules for everybody, as opposed to the creation of an empire, essentially, which is what it is today. And I know that you're not super happy with like what it is today, but to us, it's like, what could be better than the base thing at the very bottom? We're not talking about the credit instruments and promises and debt arrangements that'll be created on top. We're talking about at the very, very bottom, what could possibly be better than something that is accessible to anybody, same rules for everybody, can't be changed by anybody? I mean, that really feels like the only way out of empire for me. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, please go on that, Fictitious. Because I'm curious, do you think that the credit on top of Bitcoin can fill that gap that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think that's what in my initial recognized, I wrote in Bitcoin magazine a couple of years ago that I think Bitcoin as a reserve asset is going to be one of the key driving use cases going forward. I think where I disagree with Alex is that even going to happen? Especially in a way that is beneficial. So Alex is talking about, doing that is a way to undermine this sort of imperialistic system that we have today. Potentially, yes, I could see how that works. But now this is getting to the point about the process, right? Is that going to happen by the same entities and the same forces who have created and managed and profited off the system that both of us, or all three of us, are against? Is adopting Bitcoin somehow going to change that in and of itself? And there are two ways that could happen, right? One would be that these people that's the Trojan horse theory, right? They don't understand what they're adopting, and they're adopting it for their self-interest or whatever. And then somewhere down the line, I don't know what, but something is going to happen that they will realize that, we've adopted this, and now we have all these constraints, and we have to change whatever. Something will take that, both their desire and the ability to act on their desire away from them. That's step number one, or that's possibility number one. Possibility number two is that they're adopting Bitcoin because they've already changed their ways. And they're like, we need to move past this imperialist system. And here's a way to do that. I find both of those impossible to believe. I just cannot come to terms with how either of those could be true. Even before getting to Bitcoin, I've spent a lot of time studying, the history of social movements and whatever, especially from a leftist perspective. And I just really haven't come across social movements in history, whether they're anti-colonial or labor movements or women's rights or civil rights or whatever, where the people who, again, create and manage and benefit off a system somehow just give up that power, or somehow that power is taken away from them.
Can I on this point, just to keep things moving? So dollarization, obviously we've studied this. You're aware of this. It happens. It's happened top down and bottom up, but also top down in some cases. So why, in your view, why would a government, and there are governments who've done this, why would a government give up its monetary sovereignty and its ability to create base money by dollarizing? Like, it's basically becoming dependent on the empire. It is losing its ability to hyperinflate its people and to steal from them, which governments love to do. Why, if not, that is just better money, technologically speaking, why would they dollarize? Tell me.
I think there are two reasons. One is obviously this Washington consensus-driven propaganda, the economic education, which I have been through myself, has been for the past 50 years. which is
Mm-hmm.
teaches absolutely the wrong things about exchange rates and inflation and what countries need to do to get out of this external debt trap, etc., etc. The
Mm-hmm.
country that I'm from, and basically every country in the region suffers from these false notions of austerity driven economic policies, because they think it will somehow get them out of this debt crisis, but it hasn't for the past 70 years. That's one. And two, it's because those countries that do that get to a point where there's actually nothing else they can do to stabilize their currency, and mostly because they
Mm-hmm.
need critical imports, food, medicine, energy, to survive, which they need to pay for in
Mm-hmm.
dollars, and dollarizing is a way for them to
Right.
survive. So it's not because they think the dollar is a better currency and by adopting it they will be prosperous. It is very much a back against the wall, a measure of
Mm.
desperation. It's always a short-term measure, right? It never lasts because it's completely unsustainable. And countries realize that they can't do it, right? Or they can't sustain it. And as you said, because societies need to have money, like my initial point, money comes out of society. So societies need to have some form of control or flexibility on their money so that they can adapt it to their specific context. And so dollarization actually is, I think, a great example for what I'm trying to say, which is to say that having this externally managed form of currency is actually quite bad if it's your everyday currency.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the reserve asset we can talk about, it's a different situation. But yeah, dollarization is an example of how it's only in desperation when you really need.
Right. All right. Well, no, it's great. No, I'm really happy you said that. So two things I want to pull out of that. One is there is nothing else they can do, is what you said. And, if we look at someone like Saifedean or whatever, and I agree with him on this, I think that's what's going to happen. And obviously he's looking historically at, oh, you went on the silver standard? Well, we went on the gold standard and you kind of got wrecked. Like, oh, well, you used glass beads? Well, we had gold and you got wrecked. Like, so for us, again, royal we, like people that you're critiquing essentially, we don't think there's anything else you're going to be able to do. It's just the cold steel of a better monetary technology, and you're going to be forced to submit. The second thing that's interesting is externally managed. I love that phrase. Yes, at some point in the fiat system, everything's externally managed. Like you as whether you'd be a company, an individual, a family, a community, a government, like short of maybe one entity, the dollar hegemon, like, you are, you're being externally managed, meaning you have no control. You have no sovereignty. So I wouldn't apply the same phrase to Bitcoin, like to a country adopting Bitcoin. It's not externally managed. It's managed by the public. It's managed by the people. It's managed by the global public group of people who voluntarily adopt this thing. So I think it's just such a different paradigm shift. Like it is indeed not externally managed. Like it won't be like, hey, yeah, that country over there is going to decide the interest rates for us. No, it'll be not that at all. It will be something quite different. So I would be excited to leave this world where like everybody's externally managed. I think that would be pretty great.
Yeah. I think that my counter to both those points is that this sort of analysis and narrative, I think, doesn't really take into account the embedded power structures that we necessarily live in, right? So, for example, when you do a first point about how different societies win over each other, that's because of the power imbalances that exist for many other reasons, which is, access to resources and social norms and whatever. And then obviously their money wins and becomes the dominant form of money. But that's not because if the US dollar, for example, right? The US dollar is the global reserve currency because the US is coming out of the Second World War, even the First World War, was one of the most powerful countries in the world for non-monetary reasons, right? For not because their currency was managed in a
Yes,
particularly better way. So money is a
correct.
representation of that power difference. And so to your second point about externally managed, the two sub-points are wherever you can have any form of money, it doesn't necessarily, even if that gets adopted, which I don't think it will, because people would not want to give up those power differences and those power structures. But even if it was, in and of itself, that doesn't resolve the power imbalances, right? And the externally managed point, I think, stays true because it's not managed by a third party. It may be managed, it's not managed by the people, right? Because it's fixed. It's fixed money supply. So it's not like people vote on like, hey, it's 21 million, this person should get more of it or less of it or whatever. So it's fixed, right? And that does take away the flexibility that countries and economies need to adapt to their specific contexts. So it's not managed by a hegemon, which is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it puts everyone on an equal footing because the power imbalances remain entrenched. And I think the power imbalances, which manifest or not manifest, but are driven by vast things.
But do you? I mean, how can you? But so you have people who are essentially alchemists of monetary policy. Some of them are in purest form, like a king will just like say stuff. But more likely, it's like a group of people reporting to a military government or some kind of oligarchy or corporatocracy globally. That's kind of where we are today, right? Where is your trust in those people to do the right thing? I guess I'm really searching for that.
That's the point. There's no trust in those people, which is why I'm saying that to make progress.
So why would flexibility be a good thing if those people are always going to be in charge? They're always going to be trying to self-serve and be corrupt. Like what?
That's the thing, right? So the first step is to make sure those people are not in charge, right? And that's why I think that's
easier said than done.
No, I mean that's the point of like social movements and revolutions, right? So like the point is the way to move past the current system.
Right.
I think there are people who obviously have access to resources and access to capital. How do we take that away from them? That's sort of the one line summary of what needs to be done, right?
So can we just to be specific? So like you're looking at Syria, and that's a way to do it. We don't know which way it's going to flow, but hey, people like fought the dictator, they got rid of them, and now they're installing some kind of vaguely religious technocracy, meritocracy type system, and maybe it'll be great. We don't know. I mean, clearly, I think it's better than what was before. But you're basically saying people have to do that to win. I guess my counter would be Bitcoin's a peaceful revolution, and it's the one thing we can do where we don't have to rely on violent revolutions. Like this is something where people can meaningfully upgrade their personal life, their community life, their family life without needing to topple somebody, because not everybody wants to do that. The Syrians had to. That's a tough stretch, man. Like they all.
But how do they do that? What example is there?
They fought and they sacrificed their lives,
No, I mean the Bitcoin example. Like, what is, apart from the fact that, okay, the price goes up, you have more money. Apart from that, what is a way where a country or a society or whatever scale you want to talk at, simply by adopting Bitcoin, have been able to undo the power structures that existed in that place, where they've been able to change how resources are managed, etc., etc.
This episode is brought to you by Casa. For those of you out there who want to protect your Bitcoin, I want to tell you about Casa, the leading Bitcoin self-custody solution. If you're serious about protecting your Bitcoin, then you need a rock-solid security plan, and Casa gives you just that. With their multi-signature security and key management services, Casa makes it easier than ever to take control of your Bitcoin without the risk of a single point of failure. Casa also now has a private client option, which gives you a purpose-built security program with ongoing advisory, advanced verification inheritance, a 24/7 security emergency line, and lots more. To find out more about Casa's private client solution, go to casa.io, which is casa.io. This episode is brought to you by Ledger. If you're serious about protecting your Bitcoin, Ledger has the solution you need. Their hardware wallets give you complete control over your private keys, ensuring that your Bitcoin stays safe from hacks, phishing, and malware. With Ledger's easy-to-use devices and the Ledger Live app, managing your Bitcoin has never been more convenient. Whether you're a long-time holder or new to the world of Bitcoin, Ledger makes it simple to keep your assets protected. If you want to find out more, visit ledger.com and secure your Bitcoin today. That is ledger.com.
I think the crux of this is kind of coming down to the question of whether Bitcoin will co-opt the state or the state will co-opt Bitcoin. And so, Alex, I think it would be good for you to explain why you think Bitcoin will actually co-opt the state.
and just to like conclude the last piece, like the answer is in the human rights applications. There are people whose lives are meaningfully better today because they have neutral open money that can't be censored, that can't be frozen, that can't be stopped, and that can't be devalued. And whether you're in West Africa or Southeast Asia or in Detroit, it doesn't really matter where you are. Like those are really important properties. And those are meaningfully making individuals' lives better. Like there are people I know who have family in a particular place, whether it be Venezuela or Palestine or Cuba or whatever. Like the Cuban government today and the American government working together have created a situation where Western Union was just like shuttered again, right? Because of this new Trump sanction stuff. Well, that's insane. That means like all these people can't send value to their family. Well, we don't have to live in that world anymore. So we can just have a world where we can be peer to peer, and we can have a peer to peer economy, and we can be unstoppable. And that's I guess what I'm most excited about the state co-opting or Bitcoin co-opting the state. I had a conversation with Ben from Epsilon Theory, Ben Hunt, about this a few years ago. And it's interesting to watch what has happened since, because he was transfixed by this idea that Wall Street would sort of control Bitcoin and then use it for its ends. And I was always like, well, what do you mean, man? Like are they going to prevent me from being able to send Bitcoin to you? Like, I don't understand. And he couldn't really answer me. And my point is that big bad adoption theory, like the worst Wall Street banks and the worst odious regimes and capitalists or imperialists or Marxists or whatever your your kind of boogeyman is, depending on your political position, they're all going to use this thing because of its incredible rise in value over time. And because of the way it works scientifically, that's just going to continue to happen over time, is what we think, because it's scarce. And there's nothing digital on the planet that's digital that's scarce. It's the only thing. So this is something we believe quite deeply in. It's just that simple, 21 million. And because of that, all these bad guys, quote unquote, are going to adopt this thing. But that doesn't impact me from paying Danny in Bitcoin, or from Danny paying his family, or from the three of us creating some sort of app where we can create a community bank with Bitcoin or Bitcoin derivatives or whatever. Like they could do whatever they want to do. And I agree, like it won't be always kumbaya. Like it's going to empower some really bad people along the way, just like the internet did, and just like mobile phones did, and just like any technology does. But I think you're missing the forest for the trees if we only focus on that. Like, yes, it's meaningful that Putin can now like do trade if he wanted to, and accept payments and do international trade in a currency that no other government can freeze. I mean, that's pretty important. I mean, even doing trade with India, it's like he's got to deal with rupees, and it's like the Indian government can freeze those, and it's not that great. He's got to deal with China. That's not fun. So, yes, it's true that a dictator can do trade or save in a way that the other countries can't take. But the real revolution is the fact that 140 million Russians can interact and do commerce and save in a way that he can't stop, right? So it's asymmetric. It's true that, yes, bad guys will adopt this thing, but the bigger picture is that anybody can adopt this thing. And that's never been the case for fiat currency, save metals and gold, which just don't work in a 21st century system. Like every other fiat currency is political. It can be turned on and off by the people who control it. And we're here to say that that's bad, and we have something that's better, and society will improve. Like, as a direct downstream, like, phenomenon from using that, and from that growing around the world. And the only way it can grow around the world is if it outcompetes every other asset. if it's going to, as it has done, it has literally outcompeted every other asset in the world since it was created, right? So that's how it gains adoption. And then from there, this is the Trojan horse theory. Like they know that it could take their power away from them. Just like the Trojans were sitting there looking at this thing in the field that the Greeks had left. And they're like, I don't know about that thing out there. Well, but it looks so great. Let's bring it in. And then, of course, they get sacked. So that's kind of the idea. Like, and I've talked to a lot of people at the highest levels of some of these organizations. And, you can tell that they don't really, it's hard for me. Like, do they really believe what they're saying? Do they really believe that Bitcoin's going to like reinforce the dollar system? Like, I can't imagine that behind closed doors, they actually agree on that, or they actually believe in that. They're saying that to preserve their business or to do whatever they need to do to protect themselves. They can't actually believe that Bitcoin is not a threat to the dollar. Like, that's crazy talk to me. But they can't say that because that would be bad. So they have to do their thing. So what you're watching is a collective kind of almost like a psychosis in a way, where it's like they can't, they can only say that Bitcoin's good for the system. And because if they said otherwise, it would raise questions. But like, it's pretty freaking obvious that like the United States adopting a strategic Bitcoin reserve is really bad for the dollar. Like there's no world where that's good for the dollar. Like, that's insane. But they're all out there. All these people from Wall Street and government have to go out and say it. It's insane. It's amazing to watch. It's going to be really fun to look back on in 20, 30 years. But my point is that like this is how the adoption mechanism drives. It's NGU first. The only way it works is if this thing outcompetes every other asset. Otherwise, we're back in 2010 playing around on message boards. No. Now it's like $2 trillion asset, right? So it has to be NGU first. That's where 21 million comes in. And then we get freedom go up, right? Because everybody's pouring into it. We get new people involved. We get new designers, new UX. We get new programmers, new coders, all the geniuses. Like, I'm so confident that in 2050, the top 10 list of people who've contributed to Bitcoin, we only know 2 or 3 of those people now. Yeah, of course, it's going to be Satoshi, Hal, maybe Dorsey, maybe one other person. But the other 5, 6, 7 people aren't in Bitcoin yet. And they're going to come because like 98, 99% of the world hasn't used Bitcoin yet. And we're just getting started. So it's like, it fills me with a lot of hope, which is something that I think we can maybe, talk about a little, is hope in a better future. Like, I think a lot of people are black-pilled, right? They're like, okay, fuck, like Marxism, it didn't really work. We couldn't take power from the capitalists. Capitalists are like, man, it's hard to fight the public state, this ever-growing, life-sucking socialist monster. Like, there's a lot of black-pilling on both sides, right? So I don't know whether I'm right, but it's great to believe in something that, I don't know, just fills me with like complete unstoppable optimism about how we can have a better future. And don't underestimate that. Like, that's a movement of people. It's a religion basically, but it's like a movement of people globally who believe in this. And it's not like something where it's you go to church or you have some monotheistic religion or other religion, and they're saying the stuff that clearly didn't happen or make sense. No, Bitcoin happened. It's a thing. You can have a Satoshi. It's not like you're drinking the blood of Christ or something here. No, this is a thing that you can actually send to somebody else and they value it. And yes, it's religious, but it's more than that, right? It's like, it's to your point, it's power, it's society, it's all these things. So, I'm excited about the way it's going to happen. And I've just been sitting back and watching. It's incredible to see all these bad actors adopt this thing. It's like, of course they're going to adopt it, right? So anyway, thanks for letting me go on my rant.
That was a good rant, and one that I agree with a lot of that. I'm really curious to hear your response to that, Fictitious. But one of the things that I wanted to raise before you get into it is I've seen you say that you think, like, quote unquote status quo adoption of Bitcoin is not a good thing. But I'll let you go on that.
Yeah, there were numerous points where I wanted to intervene, but Alex's eyes were
Thank
so
you.
bright and he was so in the zone that I was like, people should be able to watch this. Yeah, so let me actually try to think of how to, maybe I'll respond in 3 ways. With three points. And the first one was, yes, I think a Cuba example and Syria, Libya, whatever other examples you gave, totally applicable. But I think those are the extreme cases, right? The edge cases. And I don't think, of course for Cuba, it's a good thing to be able to transfer value through Bitcoin, but can't really have a sort of philosophical case for a global market system based on, very extreme edge cases. So I'm still sort of curious to hear more mainstream examples of this because, and this is my second point, because I think when you were explaining the sort of causal mechanism of how that change happens. You were talking about, you know, by having Bitcoin, there would be nothing will be able to stop us, the three of us, for example, from transacting, and you can't, like, devalue it or whatever. But actually, when you were talking, I was thinking about the same phrase you used. I was going to say to you that I think you're missing the forest for the trees, and I think the way that is because I think, oppression is so much more complicated. Like, how does Bitcoin adoption stop people from like capitalists from underpaying laborers? How does it stop them from extracting natural resources or exploring communities to do that, or the tons of other stuff that happens just by having a currency or a monetary asset that you can use for transactions, etc., is good. It solves a very specific problem in society, but it doesn't solve everything, right? And the core drivers of socioeconomic inequality and all of those things are people having the power to exploit, the natural resources and labor and all that other stuff, right? So I'm still curious to hear of an example, either conceptual or otherwise, right? Of what is that causal mechanism where you say, okay, by adopting Bitcoin, now these companies, for example, don't have the ability or the desire to underpay workers or to exploit the ecological resources or the kinds of other stuff they do.
Okay.
And the third point was, I mean, on this point, I think you would have to agree with me. I think you were saying that, people who are saying this about the SBR or whatever, they obviously don't believe that, and they know that Bitcoin adoption will be bad for the fiat system. But you would have to agree that is a really a faith-based argument. Like, yes, that could be true, but there is just no. I don't know. I find that hard to believe. And again, obviously, I don't have proof of what I'm saying, and I'm guessing neither do you. But it seems like a very important pillar in the argument to have a faith-based argument for. Yes, these people, maybe they're sort of walking into this, and they're on the one hand adopting it, and on the other hand having to make all these public claims about how, yeah, we support the US dollar or whatever. But maybe that's not true. Maybe, and there are ways where I can think of how it does support the current system, and I think the Bitcoin Policy Institute memo lays that out very clearly about the specific ways and the specific mechanisms through which it will reinforce the US dollar, frankly, reinforce US imperialism. Like, that's what that memo is talking about, right? Like, there's no question about that.
Right.
And that could, that could be true. And I think it's very hopeful. I'll give you that. I think it's very hopeful and it's very optimistic to believe that so many of these people who, govern our society and have all the resources are walking into this without knowing what they're walking into. But I would be skeptical of that. And I think I just haven't seen enough examples of communities. Again, I know, major big countries haven't gotten there yet, but even communities or smaller economies adopting Bitcoin outside of an edge case or an extreme case, and there being some sort of transformation of the socioeconomic relations of that place, where suddenly people are not exploiting anymore, and there are no underpaid workers and stuff like that. That to me is the crux of the argument. So I think, I would sort of take one step towards you and say, in this fight and in this struggle, what you defined is a very important facet, but it's a facet. And I think there's a bigger picture, there's a larger sort of mosaic here that people need to get on board. And this can be one part of that mosaic, but it's definitely not, it's not the canvas. And I think that difference between being a part of the picture and being the canvas is a very important philosophical difference to make.
Yeah, I mean, look, Bitcoin fixes this as a meme. Bitcoin fixes this as fun, because clearly it doesn't fix everything. Obviously, like just because the money's better doesn't mean, to your point, that all the rainforests are going to come back and be saved. Like, this is ridiculous to think that. However, when you actually sit down and look at it, it's kind of crazy how many things it improves, right? So, like, the list grows. So Again, refrigeration. There are second order effects of the invention of refrigeration that the people who invented the refrigerator could never even thought of. The second, third, fourth order effects of Bitcoin creation is we're only starting to understand it. I mean, to your most sort of basic point, I'll just list a couple examples of what I'm thinking. Things like labor, like marginal theory labor, labor disparity around the world, as two examples of things. Well, I mean, one of the reasons why marginal theory of labor, why workers get so screwed, essentially, it's hard for them to negotiate raises, and the currency they earn is in a bad technology that depreciates, and the only real way you can grow is by transforming that wage currency into like a stock or equity, or to invest it in a company. And most workers don't have access to those things. So it's like they're kind of stuck. So if all of a sudden they can just convert or just straight up earn their wages in a technology that outcompetes over time, stocks, bonds, Uber angel investment, things that were only available to the 1% of the 1% before, I mean, that's pretty amazing. And I'm not just making this shit up. Like, if you listen to the guy who probably made the greatest angel investment of all time, Gary Tan, he said that when he made that, and I can't remember if it was Uber or Coinbase or something like that, but it was like, let's say, the best one ever. He was like, if I had just bought Bitcoin with that amount, I should have just done that. Like, Bitcoin actually outcompeted the greatest angel investment of all time. So it's giving that access to everybody. So I think that when it comes to like how people are exploited through labor, like it gives them a way out of just getting screwed over and over again, even if their employer doesn't want to give them a raise. But the other piece is the labor arbitrage thing. Like, you can be at this company and you can just pay people less in some other country. And the justification for that and the ease of that is almost like coded over with the paperwork of the currency, the different currencies. It's 180 different currencies. It's way easier to pay someone less than Nigeria if it's in Naira and all this other stuff. No, but if it's all the same, okay, well then, why am I making less than that person over there? Like, I actually think this is quite significant. So if we're all using one open neutral currency standard, I think that's going to tighten up a little bit. Is one of my points. As far as like other seemingly ridiculous things that it could fix, I mean, we talk about foreign exploitation and war. Like, I mean, one of the ways that America, and there's a great book on this called Taxing Wars by Sarah Kraft. It's an unbelievable book, The History of American War Finance. I think it's fair to focus on America because it's the largest war maker ever, right? Like, in the last couple hundred years. The reason we've been able to fight all these wars is because the people are no longer involved in the war making, which is really bad. And totally, basically, her thesis is that the way the way that war finance has evolved has disconnected the public from the war making. 100 years ago, in World War I, Korea, and World War II, and the Korean War as the three big examples, the public was very involved in war making. There was a draft. There were taxes that said for war, and you like read them, and you like got taxed, and you understood that was happening. And people bought what are in today's terms trillions of dollars of Liberty bonds, but they were contributing directly to the war effort. They knew it. It was like a patriotic thing to do. And then, of course, again, blood, like the draft. So post LBJ, post 67, we've never had draft. We've never had war bonds in any meaningful sense. And we certainly haven't had higher taxes for wars. In fact, the whole system is built in a way where when people buy treasuries from the U.S. government, whether it be banks or foreign entities, etc., they have no idea what particular sector of the economy that's funding. Like, it doesn't say to bomb people in Yemen over here and this over here. Like, if it did do that, the war bonds would be worth way less, obviously. Like, I don't want to bomb people in Yemen. Like, I don't think the Credit Suisse guy wants to either. So, like, it would be less. Like, but it's not. It's disguised, and it's all just debt. Like, there's no like specific. You can't kind of specify. So my point is that the way this has all evolved is only possible with fiat currency. Like, it's only possible with this hidden sleight of hand thing that allows Obama to go wage this war in 5 countries that nobody knows about in America. If you had a Bitcoin standard, that's not happening. I'm not saying we're not going to fight wars. We're totally going to fight wars, especially ones that matter. if some country bombs New York City, yeah, we're going to go fight them. Yeah, because the American public's going to be like, yeah, we want to go do that. But these like totally unknown to the public sort of colonial wars abroad that are, the cost is just like inflation at home, but nobody can put together the pieces because nobody has any idea what's going on. Not happening. So that's like another one. And the third one would be energy poverty. Energy poverty is the most potent thing probably holding back civilization and people expanding and getting the same chances as other people. And I know you've written about some of this. Who's going to do that? Who's going to, in the same way that like nobody wants to improve the currency technology of people in Libya or in Ethiopia, that like in fact the whole exploitative system is built on the birr in Ethiopia continuing to just get devalued. Like no one from like the Red Cross or the IMF or the UN has ever come in and say, hey, we should give these people dollars. We should give them the best money. No, that's never ever been said. Like they would never do that. They're like, no, let's give them the worst money, right? In the same way, the energy poverty thing, like who's going to come in and electrify these countries? It's like, it's only done out of altruism. It's not profitable really usually to do it. And and then it takes like 20 years because it's not capitalistic. It's like there's no actual skin in the game from anybody. And it's like, it's like this little project. I think Bitcoin's going to fix that too. I mean, I think Bitcoin mining will lead to within 20 to 30 years, essentially everybody in Malawi having electricity. Is a country I visited recently. Today, there's only 12%. So whether it be energy poverty, forever wars, labor exploitation, I mean, these are huge things that, perhaps it won't have the same impact that I'm implying, but like Bitcoin's going to have impact there. This isn't just like changing the color of the note that you get from the bank. This thing's going to have a major, major impact. And we've both thought about it long and hard. I just think it's going to have an overwhelmingly positive one as it shifts power back into the hands of the people. And away from corporations, faceless corporations and governments.
Well, Alex, we've seen that. Like a little over a year ago when we were in Malawi, we saw a mini grid that I think was originally a charity project from the Scottish government. And it had always been...
Yeah, it went nowhere.
It went nowhere. And then in come Bitcoin miners, and all of a sudden that's like a profitable venture. And now Gridless have plans to expand that all across Africa.
Yeah.
So, but before we...
But here's the crazy part that Fictitious, probably, because he stared at this. The amazing thing is the people don't get screwed in this.
Mm-hmm.
Like usually the people just get screwed when the capitalists come into these foreign countries. No, the people in that town are now paying less for their energy bill than they were before. And it's like, this is something different. This is like a new animal. And I think I attribute it directly to the technology of Bitcoin, to the currency itself, the characteristics, and the scarcity. I mean, it all kind of comes from there.
So I do have a question for you, Fictitious, but do you want to respond to that first?
Yeah, I think... Again, Alex makes these points very passionately, so it's very hard for me to then go against.
You're a passionate guy. Come on, you're very passionate.
But I think the crux of it is, I think a lot of the examples you gave are localized. I think they're true. Obviously, energy one is one that I'm very familiar with. Was working on something similar in Kenya as well. But the two responses I would have is, I think one, for the war example, whatever, I sort of skeptical of that. I think war finance has always been a thing. Just in the American Revolution itself, when, America was going to fight that war, there was a shortage of gold, silver coins that they had. And war that didn't stop them from being able to finance the war, right? They just created paper money for their soldiers to pay them. And you can
Continentals.
Yeah. And you keep pushing out the redemption, right, for that paper money. So war finance, again, my point about the transaction was whether it's commerce or whether it's to finance wars or whatever, people will always find a monetary innovation to make that happen. Of course, your point about there's a lot more opaqueness about how that happens today than even 50 years ago. I think that's a reflection of sort of neoliberal society and where we are, not a reflection of fiat versus other forms of money. It's just, how society in general has gotten. So very sort of atomized, very sort of confusing, sort of hard to make sense of things. That part is true. But I think on this, the energy poverty example, whatever, and sort of, again, to make it conceptual to apply to other examples as well, there's this, for me, it's about why are these things problems today? The reason they're problems today is because people want to make them problems today because it helps the rich become richer. Energy poverty or labor exploitation, whatever. These are not things that exist because, oh, we don't know where to fix it. These are intentional issues that are created because they serve the system. So my point number one would
Yeah.
be, again, why would people who benefit of and create this issue then suddenly be willing to adopt a technology that is undermining that system that they profit off? And then two, which is less political, is just about, I think, it's a point around complexity, which I think at sort of local or smaller scale or micro levels, things can work in a specific way. But as soon as you go from the micro to macro, everything becomes different, right? There are emerging properties. There's a lot more, for lack of a better word, complexity in that system. And so to assume that the value that those features will sort of transition from the micro to the macro doesn't necessarily have to be true. And that's something, societies and systems are not built bottom up. They're very much a combination of top down, bottom up, and there's sort of, emerging properties through that process. So I would be sort of just cautious. If nothing else, if not skeptical, then I would be very cautious of how those values transition from the micro to the macro. Yes, again, like I said, the energy poverty example is very familiar with that, and that is a great way, like with microgrids and Bitcoin mining, to solve the electrification problem in South Asia and Africa and wherever. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a way to have this huge grid or to be able to power, I think 2 billion people suffer from lack of electricity today or whatever. That's a very different scale of problem, and I would say it doesn't have to happen in this capitalist 20 years way. Like China is a great example of how things can happen in a top-down, very, very quick, very, very accessible way. At least as far as infrastructure is involved, it's just about having the right incentives in place. So I know you're very skeptical about China in general, which is perfectly fine, but just infrastructure example is when there's this push from the state, and I don't mean politicians, I mean the state as this conceptual platform where people get together. It's just an organizing entity, right? When there's that push, things do get done very efficiently and very quickly. So I would just think about that complexity point more than anything, that, things do look very different between the micro and macro levels. And I think, democracy is actually a wonderful example of that, where in specific smaller circumstances works really well. As soon as it becomes this big thing across, a big context, multi-ethnic, multi-racial societies, etc., it becomes a different thing, right? And so there's some level of, again, if not skepticism, then, caution, I would say, for people to think about, what does this actually look like? And I think, so much as I'm not just going to critique, but also think about a reframing that is helpful, is to say, going back to my original point about social drivers, what are the drivers that create these issues at the macro level in and of itself? Ignore the micro. That's an important but separate problem to solve. But at the macro level, with how the trade system is set up, how the oligarchy system, as you were talking about, is set up, what are the drivers of that system? And then how can we directly tackle that with Bitcoin or without Bitcoin, without going through or without relying on this bottom-up, step-by-step way that works its way up. So I think if nothing else, people should think about these two things as parallel. Even if you don't want to say one is more important than the other, there are two parallel streams of analysis and thought. And I think too many people rely on saying, oh, the micro works really well, so by definition, once this scales up, it will work the same way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, that's been my career, is I don't know what, to your point, I think I know, but clearly I agree with you. I don't know what's going to happen in 20 years with the global trade system. What I know today is that Bitcoin is an awesome human rights tool for individuals and dissidents and micro situations. And that's why I do what I do. And that's why my organization is involved, because it's kind of like encryption or signal. It's just, it may help bad people too, but it really helps activists, right? So So, it's really fun to engage in this. And I would say that like the work you're doing and the thought you're bringing to this can only sharpen our sword. Like it can only make what we're doing more realistic, more like better, stronger, smarter, which is why I like engaging with you. But just two last things before turning to you, Danny. But why? Why would people do this? You say, like, if it's going to take their power away from them? Well, because of the incentive alignment. Like what? Like, well, why? Right. So why would someone go and electrify a nation in Africa if that's going to end up being more competitive on labor markets and eventually taking power away from them? Because they're making money while they're doing it, right? So, traditionally when you have like you're helping people out of energy poverty, it's completely altruistic. You don't make any money. And it creates this weird like patriarchal, patronizing kind of dependency thing. It's not great. But if we're just doing business and I want to come and do this, I don't care about the town over there. Don't really care at all. I'm just going to make money because there's some energy here that's going wasted, and I want to turn it into capital for me and my business. The incentive alignment is amazing, and it's the same way with the Trojan horse theory and Wall Street and adoption that I was mentioning before. Like, it doesn't require altruism to do its thing, and that is so powerful and so important because unfortunately, most people just don't give a shit. I've learned that in the human rights field. Like, most people just don't care. So this is quite key. The other piece is the point you made about like, Bitcoin needing to say to people like, you can't create more, or that it would have to have some sort of authoritarian construct. And my point is it's actually quite beautiful. It doesn't have any of that. You could go ahead and you can create your own Bitcoins if you want. Like if someone wants to go fight a war and create some like Bitcoin Cash or BSV to go do that, they're welcome to. I'm not going to want that money, right? So we're living in a very different world in the Revolutionary War. We have the internet where like people are much more educated. Word's going to go around quick. We're in the like first, second inning of Bitcoin. Once we're in like the sixth, seventh inning, and like most people understand what it is and how it functions and what it works and how it works, they're not going to want your like derivative Bitcoin. I mean, and if you make it, that's going to be, you're going to have to pay a very serious interest rate for me to be interested in parting with my Bitcoin. You want me to give some Bitcoin for fool's gold? Okay. Yeah, you're going to have to pay me like 20% interest, on that or something like that. Like it's going to really take a lot for me to part with the real thing. If you want to go fight a war with continentals, you want to print a bunch of money, go for it, do it. It's not going to be worth much. So I just think it's like a very different world than before. And again, the beautiful thing is it doesn't require a monetary authority to prevent you from printing. It's just like you're going to suffer from your own consequences if you want to go ahead and print meme coins. It's like the Central African Republic. They should have just stayed humble and stacked sats. They'd be doing awesome right now if they had just invested in mining and stacked Bitcoin 2 years ago. They'd have triple or quadruple or whatever the amount of money they invested in. Instead, they lost it all, and now they launched a meme coin, and it's down 90%. And it's just like, go ahead, make your make your other currency. Go. It's just like it's and maybe you can exploit people in doing so. Clearly, like the people who they made a couple $1 million, whatever, probably with this meme coin, but like it's not sustainable, and people are gonna get pissed and fight you. And it's just like this is a harmonious way where we can all get, whether it's we can get poor slower or we can get rich faster, whatever the way you want to look at it. But we can do it in a way where there's no one's getting stolen from, right? So in any event, it's been a lot of fun, but I've enjoyed going into these things.
I just came to a realization. I think the two things that we talked about in our previous conversation, which we can get to this time, which, my responses to your point is about this concept of like money necessarily having this aspect of political authority behind it, and like can people choose this specific form of money, or is money imposed top down, etc., etc. And I think that's an important part about like, you could choose out of it. You could say, oh, I don't want this continentals to finance this war, but again, in a situation where you have political authority, that's money is an imposition of political authority in many ways. And then two, I think about like, how this works when it like scales up across different things. So like, yeah, the Central African Republic being one sort of small example, but it would look very different if it was like a global system. And, if it was money. Right now, we talk about outcompeting. It's outcompeting fiat. But imagine a world where there is no fiat, then, the dynamics become totally different, right?
Yeah.
So, but those are probably topics for another conversation. But I don't think, because I don't think this, the part around like money, I know we're talking a lot about money being a social creation and a representation of social drivers. But I, didn't talk enough about how money, because it's a social creation, gets created through political authority, right? Money is always something that you are either taxing or you have to pay your, that's how you pay for public services or utilities or whatever. And that is a way. So unless you have your incentives aligned with the people who control power in a sovereign entity, your incentives around money will also not be aligned. So that was just another thing that I think people should just think more about.
I think what you just describes history essentially up to this point. And then our royal we point would be until now, like, Bitcoin was not created by a political authority, and it was not created with an imposition of violence. There's never been a violent threat behind it. No one's ever forced it. And when they have tried to force it, it doesn't really work. It's only a bottom-up thing that happens gradually. But then suddenly, so we'll see. But I really
become a reserve asset only through political authority. It will only become a reserve asset when the government of the U.S. government or some other government says, "Oh, now we are going to."
Yeah, but that's how it's going to happen. Like, it's not going to become the open neutral currency for the whole world, and no governments are involved. That's impossible. You won't. It's like, oh, the United States government has dollars, and China has RMB, and India has rupees or whatever. But like everybody's using Bitcoin. No, that's not going to happen. Like my point is there has to be nation state adoption. It is essential to the success of the thing. If it's going to get to the point where a lot of us want it to get to, where it's like I can go to any country, I don't have to deal with a bank, I can just go somewhere, I can pay for something in Bitcoin, the person's happy to take it, I can save in it, without devaluation, people can earn wages in it. If we want to get to that world, you're going to see JP Morgan and BlackRock and all the governments and the big bad agencies. They're going to adopt it along the way. Like we can't get to the utopia without the bumpy parts. It's not possible. That's, I guess, my thesis. So anyway, we'll see where we go, and very grateful to Danny, obviously, for hosting this chat.
Well, I massively appreciate it. And I think we're not all going to agree on this, and that's okay. Like, I still think this conversation is really worthwhile.
That's the fun part.
Exactly. But before, I want to give you both a chance to kind of just give a takeaway from this debate. But before we do, Fictitious, I've got one more question for you. At the start of this conversation, you framed yourself as you're a Bitcoiner, you believe in Bitcoin. But what is it that you believe in if you don't think it's going to implement all this change that we as Bitcoiners talk about? Is this just number go up technology for you?
No. I think I was saying, right, social change or the scale of social change we need is this complicated mosaic, and Bitcoin addresses parts of that mosaic, which, stuff that Alex works a lot on, which is giving access to this global payment system, a savings technology for people who don't have access to U.S. equities, whatever. There, the energy example, obviously. So in that big mosaic of or this big forest of change, there are certain trees that Bitcoin will help grow further. I just don't think it's the facet, right? It's not sort of a totalitarian change, the scale at which we probably need. Is my point. I think Bitcoin should be a quiver. It should be an arrow in a much broader quiver. I just feel this is not about Alex. This is about most other Bitcoins that I engage with. They don't think about the other arrows in the quiver, and that's the summary of it.
Okay, that's fair. All right, so just before we close out, I think it would be good for you both to give kind of a key takeaway from this debate. So, Alex, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. I mean, look, one thing I'm going to be focusing on moving forward is like, how could I be wrong? And I appreciate these critiques and these challenges coming from someone who has found utility in this technology. One thing that I'm really focused on and thinking about a lot lately is, in 100 years, is Bitcoin going to be freedom money for everybody or just some people? And, I think that either way, it improves the state of the world in some way. But obviously, if it's only freedom money for corporations, nation states, and super rich people who can afford the on-chain fee, versus we find ways to do transaction collaboration and pools where people can actually use Bitcoin in an affordable way, even if they have no savings in 100 years. Like, those are two very different worlds. And I really want to get to the latter world. I still think it's a victory, like, if Bitcoin's around then, even if only a handful of people can use it in the most sovereign way. But I'd love to get to the point where it really fully blossoms. And I know the only way to get there is to look deeply at the difficult things and the hard things, and contemplate those quite deeply. Like, we could be wrong about X, Y, and Z. So I'm always looking at that stuff because I want to get to the better place. I just continue to be surprised, I suppose, by like the things that Bitcoin does. Like, it just kind of always it's just always outperforming what I would expect out of it. But at the end of the day, Bitcoiners in general it would behoove them to expand their political diet, I think, and just talk to more people with different views. And to go back to the beginning, I think Alan Farrington does a great job of this. If anyone's ever read his book Bitcoin is Venice, like, you can tell he really draws on all different kinds of thinkers, and that's really what I try to do in my work as well. I try to find people who I can at least agree partly with. I don't have to agree the full thing on. I mean, there are some sensational academics where they did some awesome work on, like, the IMF, for example. But I would, totally disagree with them on, like, the solution, where mostly it was like, let's support some, like, leftist guerrilla or whatever. Be like, nah. And then also they don't understand Bitcoin at all, and they think it's, like, absurd that I'd even suggest it. So it's okay. Like, we can disagree on those things, but we can agree on the fact that the IMF is, like, evil or whatever. That's fine. So my goal is to try to really, be friendly with and to engage with people who I can get kind of halfway on. And it really, really helps me. So I hope we can do more and more of this moving forward.
Yeah, they don't get Bitcoin yet, but they will. Okay, Fictitious.
Yeah. So I think Alex made a great point. And I think the three things I would say for people to help do that, both engage with more people and just think about how they could be wrong. I think the point that I started with, people should really try and differentiate between features and value a lot more. They don't necessarily have to be the same thing. And there's this jump from features to value, and people should really think about, in which context that jump applies and which it doesn't. I think the second thing is, because we live in, agnostic of this whole conversation, we do live in a very fast-changing world where lots of things are unraveling and the space for new things is emerging. So I think people really should think about the source of the ideas that they are either critiquing or adopting. I think a lot of people who think that they are against the system still deploy tools from that system. Right? They still will think of politics or economics or whatever from this very liberal perspective, even though liberalism is what has, shaped the system today. Again, doesn't mean it's good or a bad thing, but just recognizing that, you might be critiquing the system, but you are still using the intellectual or conceptual tools from that system, and just being conscious of that and, making sure you're doing that intentionally. I think a lot of conversations, particularly around inflation, are very much mainstream Econ 101, even though the same people are trying to critique mainstream economists, on inflation. So that's two. And I think three is, because we live in this very complex world, this quote that I read somewhere on Twitter a few years ago is that it's much better to focus on the left-hand side of the equation than the right-hand side. The right-hand side is like, is equal to one number or one answer, a lot of us spend a lot of time arguing about that answer, or that prediction, whatever. I think it's impossible for anyone to predict the outcome of a complex system. It's much better to spend your energy on the left-hand side of the equation. What are the input variables? And do people have a very good grasp of those input variables? But that's the only way you'll be able to know that you're wrong early and pivot. If you don't know why something is happening, you won't know why it's not happening, and you can't pivot. So that's, the premise behind, my work and my newsletter is to really focus on the left-hand side of the equation, understand how energy works, understand how raw materials work, understand how money works. And then I don't know what the future will look like, but neither do you. And, at least we'll be able to see the signposts as they emerge, right? Rather than arguing about this can happen or it will happen tomorrow or whatever. That's just a waste of people's time, right? So I think, focus on the left-hand side of the equation, because there's no way anyone is predicting, how things are going to unravel in any dimension of society. So I think people should be a lot more humble and a lot more willing to understand the left-hand and really sort of the fundamentals. Because without that, there is no hope. If you don't understand the fundamentals of everything, there is no hope in sort of being able to analyze or predict the future.
Well, just one quote to end it on, which I think helps because it's from someone who's a famous socialist in history, and most Bitcoiners would be like, and it's fine. You don't have to agree with what else they say, but they have a lot of these people have amazing insights. And I'm going to say something from Antonio Gramsci, and he has this quote that I just love, and I think it applies to the field that we've been playing on during this conversation, basically. In that, we have this old system, we both agree it doesn't really work, and we'll see where we go from here. And the quote is, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." And that's kind of where we are. Bitcoin just can't today serve everybody, and the old system's definitely broken. It's just going to take time, and in that time, a lot of bad shit's going to happen. But it's on us to see how best we can ameliorate some of those things and chart a better course. So, with that said, Danny, thank you for resuscitating WBD, keeping it going. It fills such an important gap, I feel, in the ecosystem, and it's an honor and a pleasure always to be on, and super happy that we could have Fictitious today. So, thank you both, gentlemen.
No, thank you. I think this has been a really important conversation. I think there's a lot of valuable takeaways from this. So thank you for both making the time again. I'm glad we could do this, and appreciate you both.
Cool. Thank you. Next time we should fly us.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, there you go.
We'll do it in person.